Hello, and welcome to our next lesson in our Samuel series. Today we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapters 7 and 8. To bring you up to date, as you know, Samuel has been raised by the temple, and he is now, as you'll see, he'll step into his role as judge. He's been working around the temple as an apprentice. Time has gone on, and he's been you'll see as the story goes on, but as we pick up the story, we're going to actually redo verse 1 of chapter 7. Verse 1 of chapter 7, verse 1 and 2 are really kind of a transition section, a piece. Verse 1 kind of goes with back with chapter 6, at the end of chapter 6. But verse 2 of chapter 7 kind of settles that. But for us, it settles something about the ark, because the ark was captured by the Philistines. That brought a lot of death and destruction to them, so they eventually managed to get it back to the Israelites. And this here is kind of like, here is the disposition of what happened to the ark. And so picking up now with 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. And the people of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of Adonai and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. They consecrated his son, Eleazar, to have charge of the ark of Adonai. From the day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after Adonai. So, as we discussed in our last lesson, the ark has come to Kiriath Jearim, and they take the ark there. They bring it to the house of Abinadab up on the hill. They bring it into his house, or to his house on the hill. They consecrate his son Eleazar to be in charge of the ark. Eleazar will reappear in the story later in a very important role. As you'll see, he actually is a very important character to come up. He's at to this point he is a nobody from nobody. But he has been consecrated by the people to be in charge of the ark. So we also know that he is from the tribe of Levi. Well, so from that day forward, that's where the ark is lodged for at least 20 years. Now, the ark will move from here, but that's a future story, and that's as you'll see. That'll come up later, but not yet. At the point here, 20 years elapses, and the ark is there. And all of that time, the people actually are lamenting or craving after God, the loss of God in their affairs. So that's where they are, as our story picks up today, with 1 Samuel chapter 7, beginning with verse 3. Then Samuel said to all the house of Israel, "If you are returning to Adonai with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Astartes from among you. Direct your heart to Adonai and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines." So Israel put away the Baals and the Astartes, and they served Adonai only. Then Samuel said, "Gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to Adonai for you." So they gathered at Mizpah, and drew water, and poured it out before Adonai. They fasted that day, and said, "We have sinned against Adonai." And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, Adonais of the Philistines went against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. The people of Israel said to Samuel, "Do not cease to cry out to Adonai our God for us, and pray that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines." So Samuel took a sucking lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to Adonai. Samuel cried out to Adonai for Israel, and Adonai answered him. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel. But Adonai thundered with a mighty voice that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they were routed before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down as far as beyond Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Jeshanah, and named it Ebenezer, for he said, "Thus far Adonai has helped us." So the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel. The hand of Adonai was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The towns of the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath. And Israel recovered their territory from the hand of the Philistines. There was peace also between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah. And he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. He administered justice there to Israel, and built there an altar to Adonai. So, this is kind of like, okay, here is Samuel. Here's a little bit about what Samuel and what's happening here. And so Samuel, remember here back in verse 2, the people are lamenting about the loss of Adonai. And so Samuel, he comes to the major house of Israel. He says this to all the tribes. They call it the house of Israel. That is all of the tribes. So he calls together all of the tribes. And he talks to them. And he says, if you're really returning to Adonai with all your heart, then you need to go into your homes and you need to take out all the foreign gods. Take out the Baals, take out the Dagons, take out the Astartes. Astartes we know by a different name, more familiar with the different name of her, of Asherah. But Astartes and Asherah are the same. Astartes is the ancient name. Asherah is the Aramaic name or translation of Astartes, which is Astartu, which goes all the way back to Sumer again. So you have Astartes was the consort to El. And again, now, just so you recognize here, I spoke last week, and I need for us to recognize a slight difference in the theology here, or the mythology here. The Sumer has it that El begat Baal, because Baal was now the god of war, or became the epitome of war, the leader of war in the heavenly realm. So El begat Baal through Astartes, or Astartu, or as we know her later, Asherah, is the consort, and so they produced Baal. And now this is under the ancient Sumer mythology, and then Baal produces Dagon. So that is kind of the theology or the mythology of Astartes, El, Dagon, the god of the Philistines, and Baal, the god of the Canaanites. The god of the Canaanites is the god of war. Baal was the god of war or conflict, and Dagon was the god of agriculture. So this is there's a difference between these two gods and who follows them. Right now, we're looking at Dagon as the god of the Philistines. The Amorites are mentioned here also, and where is that again? Yeah, the Amorites there later on as we speak about this. Their god would be Baal, their chief god. So that's kind of like these. This is also not just, all of these conflicts aren't just political, geopolitical. They're also religious. In their world, now remember the Israelites, they're ruled by a council in Jesus' day. They're ruled by a council of elders, but which is a mixture of the wealthy, which are the Sadducees, and the religious class, which are the Pharisees. Both of these classes in Jesus' day, in the first century Roman world Israel, these two classes which ruled over Israel made up the Sanhedrin, but they were from the religious class, and so religion played a very, very dominant role in the government of the people. Religion was used to control the people, and it was an easier way, as Constantine found out later, or used also later to wrest control of the Western world through Christianity. Getting back to our story here, so that is Astartes. Samuel is telling them that if you truly want to get back to Adonai, if you really want to get back into God's good graces, then you need to get all of these foreign gods, including the Astartes, which is your fertility god here. You need to get all of them out of your homes. You have to serve, direct your heart, direct everything about you toward Adonai only. And serve only Adonai. If you do that, if you honestly do that inside your heart, inside the true being of you, then God will rescue us from the hand of the Philistines. So, the story goes on that they put away the Baals and their Astartes, and they served Adonai only. They served only Adonai. Now, all the time during the time of the judges, they kept going back to the Baals, and they kept going back to Astarte. They kept going back to Baal, and so here Samuel's telling them, you've got to put all this stuff away. And I remember back in one of the attributes of the Samuel story is that we all, and this is something you'll recognize if you look for it, is that you have a negative story. And then you have a positive story, and you have a negative story, and then a positive story. And this is true all through Samuel. It's negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive. It's really clear in the chapters 7 or 8, beginning with chapter 8, is very clear definition of negative, positive from chapter 8 through chapter 15, which is the Saul story. So. But we'll get to that when we get to it's the beginning of the kingdom here, which is, again, the Saul story for the primary part. So you have a negative, positive, negative, positive. But we'll begin with that when we hit chapter 8. But all of Samuel is like that, is negative, positive. And I know in the first lesson I think I mentioned that. So anyway, they put away all of their gods. And all of these other gods, with the exception of they have Adonai now in their hearts. Samuel then tells them that, okay, we're going to have a meeting at Mizpah. And I will say prayers for you there at Mizpah, but we all must be there because we're going to sacrifice. We're going to do this thing for God. Mizpah, now I remind you again that we've run across Mizpah before. Mizpah is a location where the people meet frequently to discuss national affairs, all tribal affairs. They go to Mizpah to make those discussions, to have those discussions. So that's where they gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I'll pray to Adonai for you. So they all gather at Mizpah, the leadership. Now, we say all Israel. Now, it's not It's not every man, woman, and child. They all don't just abandon their homes and their properties and just go. But it is the leadership class, the higher class of people, the ones that have a higher, they're higher in the class of order, in the order of things. They go. And this would be the elders, all of the leadership of the different tribes and villages and family clans and so forth. So it would be a fair number of mostly men. Wives would go also, but they would be part of the serving class. Anyway, getting back to the story. They gather at Mizpah, they draw water, and they pour it out. This is a drink offering or a water libation. This is we've seen this before. This is an idea of pouring out water. You're in a desert environment. You're in a hot desert environment. Pouring out water is an act of sacrifice, and pouring out water is an act of cleansing. So they pour it out before they drew water and they pour it out before Adonai. They fasted that day and lament about their sins against Adonai, and Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. What that means is he laid out in judgment there. He lays out the sin and then proclaims the penance or what must be paid for this, and which would be then what the sacrifice is going to be. He lays out the sin and then lays out the judgment, which would be the sacrifice. Here is the punishment that you must. Here is the punishment. Here is the act of recompense of returning back to God. So when the Philistines hear about this, though, that all of the leadership of Israel is all gone to Mizpah, the Philistines hear about this, and they decide, well, let's. One of the leaders of the Philistines says, well, we can gather enough people here, we can gather a big enough army that we can finally just take care of this. They're all gathered in one place. We can really stomp them down hard if we go now. So the Philistine starts gathering an army together, and they start moving toward Israelite territory from their cities. And the Israelites hear about this. Of course, they've always got people in scout positions watching over the things, over the no man's land between the territories, between the peoples. They hear that this, and they're afraid of this because the Philistines are a very powerful people, and they've stomped them before. In fact, the last time they had a conflict with them, if it hadn't been for that final battle there, where God kind of intervened a little bit, the Philistines would have won. They cry out about this. They're worried about this, and so. They go to Samuel and say, don't stop praying about this. Don't stop begging God for help. Don't stop doing that. Don't cease to cry out for God to help us, and that He will save us from the hands of the Philistines. So Samuel then takes the offering. He takes a sucking lamb. That is a lamb that is still, it's just a baby. It's still very, very young. They take this and they offer that as a burnt offering, as a whole burnt offering. Again, they don't take any part of it. The whole animal goes to God. And they cry out to Adonai, and God answers their prayers this time. As He draws up the burnt offering, the Philistines draw near to attack. So these are simultaneous. As they're asking God for help and sending up that offering to God, that the Philistines at the exact same time are mounting the attack. They're pushing the attack forward. And so, as the Philistines are charging forward into the attack, here God speaks. and he speaks in a voice of thunder. This isn't the first time that God has used thunder as his voice. This is a voice in other instances that the ground shakes and things shatter and walls crack. And so this is that kind of voice that God speaks out, and he thunders it against them. It throws them into confusion, and they get lost in their confusion. They get lost, and they're routed out of Israel. This is a fact, and it doesn't substantiate this story in any way, but it is a fact that the United States military has weapons of war now which are sound, and they have this big device that'll send out this sound that is below hearing, but it affects the body. It affects the body in such a way that when you hear it, you start throwing up. You get sick. You get ill because the sound is just what it does to you. And so that's just kind of, it is interesting, but sound actually can cause confusion, and it just really can affect you. And this can be even a sound that is so low you can't hear it. And maybe that's part of this. Maybe that's part of the answer here. Anyway, the people are thrown. The Philistines are thrown into confusion, and they're routed. And then the leadership of Israel step out of. They leave out of Mizpah, and they chase down the Philistines, and they take them. They chase them as far as this Beth-kar place. So after the battle, after this major conflict, which routes the Philistines all the way back to their own territory, Samuel takes a stone. Now, this is kind of reminiscent of when the Ark of the Covenant came into the farm there. They had that stone, and they did a sacrifice there. Well, he takes a stone, and he sets this stone up between Mizpah and this other town, Jeshanah. And maybe this is where the battle actually, or where the thunder struck the Philistines. But between Mizpah and this other place, between there, they set this stone. And they name it Ebenezer. For, he says, thus far Adonai has helped us. And Ebenezer means God has helped. So the Philistines there are beaten back into their own territory. And God assisted Samuel in keeping the Philistines in check all through Samuel's life, at least up to this point that the story is at in the story here. And all of the towns that the Philistines had taken away from Israel, Israel got back. It even tells us that as far that restored Israel from Ekron to Gath, all the towns between Ekron and Gath, which would be almost all of Philistine territory, is now under the control of the Israelites. The Philistines are still there, but they're not in control of their own self. At least that's what the story is trying to tell us here, that for the next few years after this particular battle, the Philistines are subdued and are under Israelite control. The Israelites also struck peace with the Amorites. The Amorites are one of the Canaanite peoples that live in their midst. The Amorites lied to. Anyway, it's in a previous story. I believe it's in Joshua. If you want to look that up. So they also have peace with the Amorites, which are a Canaanite people that they're not supposed to make peace with. Just so you know, they're not supposed to do that. Then as the story progresses, it goes on to tell us that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on the circuit. He had a circuit that he went on. It was Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah Bethel is a very important kind of a sacred spot. Bethel is a sacred place. The house of bread there is very important in their religious or in their in their religious practices, or had been in the past. So it's still considered a kind of a sacred city. It's one of the major cities that control Israel. Gilgal and Mizpah, again, Mizpah is their usual meeting place for councils of war, or when all of the tribes get together, they get together at Mizpah. We have that coin named after it as well. We are apart. These will remind us that we are apart. You may not know of that. It was kind of a military tradition that took place in the 60s, 70s, and maybe even into the 80s. Anyway, and this other place, Gilgal, which is also a very important Israelite city, is for controlling regions of Israel. So he goes to these three different cities, plus his own hometown of Ramah. And so these are the four places that are on his circuit as he goes around and he judges and he makes judgment for the people. This is his job. But he would always come back to his home there. And so he administered the justice for Israel. And in Ramah, he builds an altar to God so that he doesn't. And Bethel already has one. I'm sure there was one at Mizpah, and Gilgal probably had an altar also. Remember, Israel hasn't created a single location yet where they would go and worship Adonai. They did have one before the ark was captured, and everybody went to that place because that's where the tabernacle was. They had the ark of the covenant, and they had the tabernacle. But that was conquered. And that's when the ark was taken away by the Philistines, and they ended up the tabernacle. The ark did not go back to the tabernacle. In fact, the tabernacle has probably been dismantled, and I believe will be moved to another location, but that'll be in the future. But at the moment, it's in a house on a hill in Kiriath Jearim. Okay, so Samuel is ruling all the days of his life, and he has a circuit that he goes there, and he is the judge. Now, remember, this is in the same tradition of the book of Judges and how the judges were, is that the judges were not only they were the military leader. They kept the peace with the neighbors and among themselves, and they also judged the people. We will see that Samuel also has a different role, which is new. But in this case, at this moment, he is still acting as the judge. Continuing on now with chapter 8. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us, like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to Adonai. And Adonai said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So Samuel reported all the words of Adonai to the people who are asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But Adonai will not answer you in that day." So, we find out here that time is elapsed. Originally we went from Samuel was a child, 20 years elapsed. Now, much later time here, he's now been at the job for much longer. Samuel has become old. And so as he aged, he gave his power, some of his power, to his sons. And so he made them judges. And so maybe that way he didn't have to travel so far. So they took care of 2 of the 4 sites that he always was. He had Ramah and one other site, and maybe, I don't know. The scripture isn't very clear on that, except that they were made judges by Samuel himself. But they were not judges that followed the ways of Samuel. They didn't honor the traditions. Just like Eli's 2 sons, Samuel's sons are corrupt. They take bribes and they pervert justice. They take things for their own gain. They weren't actually administering justice. They weren't being good judges. And so the elders come to Israel, or come to Samuel there at Ramah, and point this out to him. Your sons aren't following in your ways. They're not honoring their jobs. We want a king. We want you to appoint a king over us. Well, Samuel didn't like that idea. Maybe he took it personal. God kind of points at him and says, this isn't about you, this is about me. Maybe he took it personal, but he doesn't like this idea. Maybe he understands that God is supposed to be the king. Maybe he still likes the idea of there being judges. It doesn't say anything about his 2 sons, about what he does about his 2 sons, or anything like that. But it is just kind of, it is parallel to Eli. But this time, there's no Samuel to take Eli's place. And the elders want to look like the other places, the other peoples around them. There's a little bit of a conflict here, and maybe this is also part of Samuel's conflict, is that kings, all the other kings of every other peoples out there, the people believe that their king is divinely is divine, or is divinely touched. And it's very possible that Samuel doesn't like that idea about finding a king. It's not clear, but Samuel doesn't like the idea. So Samuel goes and he speaks to God about this. And Adonai answers him as, well, I want you to listen to what they have to say. Listen to the voice of the people and what they're saying to you. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. all through Scripture, all the way up through Scripture up to this point, even up to this point, God has spoken very clearly. It's interesting that God has spoken very clearly that he intends to have a kingdom out of Israel. It's all very clear in this. You go back and you look through the Exodus and the Abraham, the Isaac, Jacob stories, the Exodus stories, all of the speaking, the talks that Moses gives, all of that, even all the way up into Joshua speaking, God is clear that he wants Israel to be a kingdom, that he wants to set up a kingdom there. But at the same time, it speaks very clearly that God is to be the king. So, God tells Samuel, it's not about you, it's about me. From the day I brought them, although God speaks about having a kingdom in Israel, God here then tells them all the way from, since the moment I brought them out of Egypt to this day, they keep forsaking me. They keep looking away from me and start looking to other gods to be their leaders. And they're supposed to look at me, but instead they look at them. So I want you to listen to them. I want you to listen to them. I don't want you to object to them. What I do want you to do is I want you to tell them exactly what a king does when they take over. That you become subject to that king when they reign over them. Tell them what happens when a king begins to reign. So Samuel goes back to the elders of Israel and he tells them, here's what God has said about this. You want to ask about a king? Okay, fine. Here's what a king will do for you. He'll take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. That is, he will conscript your sons into military service. And some of these sons will be personal servants to the king. He'll conscript them into service. This have them run before his chariots, the king's chariots. We actually see that several times as we move forward. Just off the top of my head, I recall two of David's sons do that exact same thing. And these are status symbols, not necessarily for war, to be effective in war, but it's a status thing. And so here we have that, this is status. They'll appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. So they'll have these jobs, that he'll conscript them to these jobs. He'll appoint from your children, that your sons, who he will conscript, he will appoint some of them to be officers of thousands and officers of hundreds and officers of 50s and officers of 10. He'll have them be leaders, commanders of 50s and so forth. He'll also have some of them plow the ground for his food, to reap his harvest, to work in his factories to make implements of war and equipment for his chariots. He'll take his daughters, he'll take your daughters to work as perfumers for his pleasure, as cooks, bakers, working for him in his kitchens. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards for his own, the olive orchards. And he'll give those things to his courtiers, the people who work for the court. He'll take your male and female slaves, the people that work the land for you. He'll take those people. He'll take your best cattle, your best donkeys. Now, I note here that the slaves are listed in with the cattle and the donkeys because they're owned things. I'm not condoning that. I'm just saying that that's what it is. both male and female slaves, best cattle, your best donkeys, and he'll have them go work for him. Take 1/10 of all your flocks, and it won't be your worst. He'll take your 10 best sheep, your 10 best goats, your 10 best cows, your 10 best bulls, your 10 best oxen. 1/10 of your flocks. And all of these things that he will conscript away from you, your children, your slaves, your cattle, your property, will all become his. And you yourselves will be his slaves. And you'll cry out about that. You'll complain about that. You'll beg God to take this away from us. And God's not going to listen to you, because he's telling you now. God is your king. Adonai is your king. Picking up in our story. But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of Adonai. Adonai said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Each of you return home." So Adonai explained it all, but they wouldn't hear it. They wouldn't listen to it. "No," they said. "No," they said. "We are determined to have a king over us. We want to be like other nations and have somebody who will go out and fight our battles." So Samuel goes back to Adonai and he speaks it into his ear. It says, I love this. He says, when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of Adonai. All through chapter 8 here, in fact, chapter 7, 8, hear and listen and ear play a very important aspect of the whole thing. Listen to what they have to say, God says, as we just read. So here, they didn't listen. They didn't hear Samuel when he says all of this. No, we're determined. We want to be just like the other peoples around us. We want to be just like them. We want somebody. And here we see is their main motivation. They're willing to overlook all of the burden that the king will give to them or put on them. They're willing to overlook that as long as this person will lead them and fight their battles for them. So Samuel goes back and he tells God what they have to say. So God says, okay, listen to them then. Set a king over them. At this point, God doesn't tell Samuel how this is going to work. At this point, he doesn't do that. All he does is, okay, you'll have to set a king over them. Okay, you'll have to pick somebody to do that. So Samuel then goes back to the people, tells them all to go home. And we'll see what happens next week. God bless you. Thank you for coming. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, amen.